podcasts.
The Profile. You're listening to Premier Christian Radio.
Where faith comes to life.
Hello and welcome to The Profile here on Premier Christian Radio with me, Alex Williams. The Profile is brought to you in association with Premier Christianity magazine. For a free sample copy of the latest issue, which includes features, interviews, columnists and more, visit premierchristianity.com/free sample. Today on The Profile, I'm talking with Petr Jasek, a Christian originally from the Czech Republic. Petr was in Sudan investigating persecution against believers there when he was arrested and accused of spying back in 2015. He spent 445 days in detention before intervention by diplomats secured his freedom last year. In the interview you're about to hear, Petr talks about seeing God's hand at work as he shared a prison cell with Islamic State fighters.
I was facing death penalty, actually, so hearing the sentence that I'm being sentenced to life imprisonment, in one sense, after 6 months of trial, it was not such a big surprise because during the court process, we were being portrayed in the pro-government newspapers in Sudan like the worst criminals. So in one sense, I expected somehow the sentence to be something between 15 to 20 years because they just had to keep their face. And so for me personally, it was not a big surprise. But even though it was not a big surprise, the moment when you hear a life sentence, it's something when you realize that, if the Lord will release me, then my life, the rest of my life, doesn't belong to me and belongs to Him.
You were in prison for more than a year. How would you describe that time?
This time had different stages. I went through 5 different prisons where conditions were basically going from bad to worse. I have spiritually several phases. I had a first period of 5 months when my prayer life has deepened a lot because I did not have Bible with me. Then after 5 months, I got my Bible. Then I went through a wonderful period when I could read Bible and the Lord spoke in a new way to me. And after 3 months, when our court case started and we had to be transferred to a different prison, that was the time when I was even allowed to share the gospel and preach the gospel in the one of the prison chapels that actually was in that prison at that time. And that was a wonderful time of being allowed to preach the gospel openly, even though we were under scrutiny of the secret police and there were some false brothers who reported about our preachings, but we were facing death penalty and being in prison already, so we just didn't put any self-restrictions on us, and we preached freely the gospel for about 6 months in prison.
Tell us about some of the people that you met in prison.
In the first 2 months, this was the most difficult time from several different reasons. Of course, when you happen to be first time in prison and in a foreign country, it's not an easy time. I was worried about my family because at first they had no information. And the worst, actually, what I realized was that I was put in the first 2 months in prison with members, sympathizers, and supporters of ISIS, or Daesh, as they used to call themselves. And for me, being a Christian amongst 6 other Muslim extremists was extremely difficult. But I was not in a position to ask them questions, but I was in a position to answer their questions. But I was always trying to show Christ's love to them and to be a good witness of Christ amongst them. And even though later on I was not only slandered with words, but I was also physically attacked by them to keep the Christian witness through all of that.
Was there a moment during that time in prison where you felt like it would be almost impossible to carry on?
Absolutely. The first 2 months, there was a time when I also went on a hunger strike because the prison authorities didn't want to allow me any contact with my family or the embassy. And after 4 days of hunger strike, I was brought to the hospital and forced to receive infusion of glucose. And they also tested my blood and discovered that I was heavily anemic. And that actually explained perfectly the state that how I was feeling at that time. I could not concentrate my mind. I could not remember certain passages in the Bible that I memorized when I was young. I could not remember any more than 3 or 4 first words of any songs, and that was closely related to my heavy anemia that I was suffered with. Probably partially through malnutrition, but most likely through some internal bleeding. And I was in the state when I was literally asking the Lord to keep my mind sound. That was my major concern in the first 2 months, because I was afraid that I will lose my mind, because, I was squeezed in a small room surrounded by Muslim extremists who were praying 5 times a day, and I had to stay in the toilet corner and face the toilet sink while they were praying, so that I would not, spoil their prayers. And I was also, extremely weak, and so this was a really, really difficult time for me. And these fellow prisoners, that they were really angry with me, and they started physically to attack me, and eventually they even planned to do waterboarding on me.
How receptive were they? You described trying to reflect Christ.
Whenever I shared something in my answer, which has included the gospel in it, they were listening to me. Of course, they seemed to always have the feeling that Islam was superior to Christian faith, but there were moments when they were silently listening, and I was praying for them that the Lord would reveal himself to them as a Lord, a Savior, and God. But I cannot tell, no one actually received Christ when I was there. They were just listening to me.
Was all of this part of God's purpose for your life?
Yeah, it took me to some time to understand the Lord's purpose. At first I was praying just for my release. For the first 4 months, I was just praying for my release until I had the wonderful opportunity to share Christ with. That happened in the second prison already, when they brought to our already overcrowded room, about 25 square meters, another, where we were more than 40 people, another 12 Eritrean refugees, when I could share later on Christ with them, and they accepted. So that was a moment of revelation for me, when I realized that why I had to be there for 4 months and 1 day. And I completely changed my attitude, and I started to deliberately share the gospel with my Muslim fellow prisoners, and many of them were very receptive, and they wanted to listen to me, and they were very close to accept Christ, and but shortly after that, I was again put into solitary confinement, and I believe that was also part of the plan, because after 5 months of not having Bible, then for 3 months being in solitary confinement, I had this wonderful opportunity to have the Bible with me and to read it, and just to receive a lot of new things through it.
You describe prison as being a crowded place. What about food and water? Were the prisons clean?
Absolutely not. As I said, the conditions as far as food and accommodation is concerned was always going from bad to worse. The first prison, I thought, was horrible. It was humid, moldy walls, crawling insects and flying insects all over. Running water was very rarely there. We had to bring the waters in the buckets from just one place where there was some water. Later on, when I went to other prisons, I realized that I was still living in a luxury in that first prison, because then the water became really muddy, and we had to drink water that was really dark brown, and we had to wait until the mud settled at the bottom of the bottle. And we had to wash ourselves in this dirty water, which actually then caused a lot of skin problems on me. And I was in a very desperate situation. At that time, there was a moment in my life when I really doubted whether I will come alive home.
What did you learn, spiritually speaking, about your faith during that time?
When you come through a situation like this, when you come through physical or emotional torture, in a very difficult time, depression, I would say that your prayer life gets deepened a lot. It's like what Isaiah 48:10 says, that behold, I have refined and tested you in a furnace of affliction. So in one sense, when you go through time like that, your life is being refined. And the main point of which is like comparison with refining the precious metals. The only purpose of refining the precious metals is basically that they get rid of everything that's not genuine. And I think this is the best way how to describe even my life, that you realize how many things were in your life that you needed to get rid of. And on the other hand, you realize there were so many other things that we as Christians are supposed to do, and I was not doing them. So this is definitely something that the personal spiritual life gets deepened, and the relationship with the Lord Jesus, it's much stronger and much deeper. And I also feel the being a part of the persecuted church, that in one sense it is a privilege to suffer for the name of Christ.
What brought you to Sudan?
I was at that time working for an organization. It's called Voice of the Martyrs. It is a very similar organization that actually invited me to UK, which is named Release International. They also help persecuted Christians in the same way like Voice of the Martyrs. And being in the position to oversee the work in Africa, I came to document the persecution of Christians in northern Sudan. That was my only purpose at that time, and I came only for 4 days. But when you consider the fact that from 4 days it became 445 days, so then you really start to think about what the Lord's purpose was really behind all of that.
What do you remember of the moment when you were arrested?
I actually visited only the capital city, Khartoum, which consists from 3 parts, Khartoum, Bahri, and Omdurman. And I was in all 3 parts of that. On this short trip, I had some scheduled meetings that I set up with my Sudanese partners, earlier, because I met them at the conference in Addis Ababa in October 2015, just about maybe 2 months before I got arrested in Sudan. So, this was just the main purpose to document. And my moment of arrest was quite unexpected. It actually came at the very last moment of me being in Sudan. I was in the airport already, holding my boarding passes to fly to Nairobi, from Nairobi to Amsterdam, and Amsterdam to Prague. And when I was just heading towards the passport control, I was arrested by the secret police, and all my equipment, cell phone, laptop, camera, video camera, and all the memory cards, everything got confiscated by the secret police, and I was being accused of spying, interrogated for 24 hours, and later on put in prison.
What prompted those charges? Tell us a bit about an injured student from Darfur who you met. You paid for their medical treatment, is that right?
Yeah, I brought some practical help for a burnt student. I can't go into more details because this person is still living in Sudan. But I think what was viewed as espionage or waging war against the country is that probably. I took some photos of the injuries of the student, and this was later on, even though I deleted these photos, they were able to recover the photos from my memory card, which I could say it was my fault that I did not rewrite it with a special program that I also had in my laptop. But I would say that I was followed on every step. And actually, when I was being arrested, and they asked me about the purpose of my trip, which I told them was a tourism, and I had a tourist visa for 4 days. They did not like that answer, and they started to show me photos from all my meetings, including those that took place in a complete darkness. They actually were following me with night vision camera, and they showed me the photos at the airport. So I think even though I would not have anything, they would not get anything from my memory card or from my external hard drive, where they also were able to recover some of the old materials that I didn't even pay attention that I ever used that hard drive to transfer some of the photos from Sudan also. They had enough evidence in 6699, that I was spying, because they followed me on every step, and they recorded even what was later on showed at the court hearing. They were also recording remotely our conversation inside the building. So realizing that how sophisticated their surveillance was, it was probably enough for them just to arrest me. Just the fact that I came to Sudan and I met with Christian leaders there who are or who were known like Christians who are following Christ's Great Commission, and they are preaching the gospel to every person, including the Muslim majority.
How did you first come to the attention of the Sudanese authorities? Where did that suspicion towards you first hail from? Do you have any idea?
I would say that because I attended this conference in Addis Ababa in October, I believe that there were some people that later on reported, maybe even some of the representatives of the churches who might have reported being summoned by the secret police and reported and telling them the details. I also remember when I was being interrogated the first day for about 24 hours, I saw the person walking the stairs in the headquarters of the secret police that I remembered seeing his face at the lobby of the hotel in Addis Ababa in October 2015, where the conference actually took place. So no doubt that this conference was closely monitored, surveilled by the secret police, and no doubt that there were some of the people who took part at the participants at the conference who then gave important information to the secret police. Because when I was interrogated, being asked for some details like names of the organizations or representatives, I had no idea. I honestly only remembered maybe 3 first names of those people that I exchanged my business cards with. I did not remember those details, but when they were prosecuting me after 4 months being in this first prison, being transferred to police station where there were prosecutors, I realized they had on a table a stack of papers where they have the alphabetical list of all the organizations and their representatives being present at the conference. So no doubt that they got this information from someone else.
And as far as you're concerned, these accusations of funding rebel movements, of being involved in espionage, none of that was true.
I was actually sentenced to life imprisonment, and part of the sentence was that I supplied the SPLA, the South Sudanese Army, with ammunition. That's nonsense. Nothing, never happened anything like that. The only ammunition, in inverted commas, would be the Christian ammunition, the Bibles and Christian literature that we were distributing to South Sudanese Christians when they were actually experiencing genocide. Since the late 80s till 2005, more than 2 million Christians were killed in Sudan.
What diplomatic intervention did it take to free you?
Altogether, like the Czech government, Czech Ministry of Foreign Affairs, together with many Christian congressmen and senators from the United States, they were working together on the diplomatic field to release not only me, but also the 3 Sudanese brothers. And we were quite sure that the Lord was the one who was holding the keys from ourselves. we were so much encouraged by hearing through letters from my family and some information how many Christians were praying for us and supporting our families and just lifting up us up in their prayers. And that's what I think is the most important thing, that even Christians that are the supporters of Release International in UK, I would like them to encourage them to continue to pray for the persecuted Christians, and especially for those who are in prison, because the Lord also may give them the right words whenever they open the mouth to share the gospel with their fellow prisoners. And I would like to encourage also them to pray for their family members. It was probably harder for our wives and children than it was for us. We knew the conditions that we were in. They were not easy, but we knew them. Our families, just consider the fact that Pastor Kuwa's family, they had no idea for about 5 months whether their husbands and fathers of their children are alive or dead. These two people were actually released after 3 months after my release. They were released on May 11th, 2017.
So you were detained along with 3 other Sudanese men. Can you just explain what has happened to them?
Yeah, one of them, Pastor Kuwa Shimal, he was acquitted on January the 2nd. That was part of the, arranged, I would say, tragic comedy, what the process, the court case looked like. Just to show that, we, the rest of us, we 3 of us, that we were sentenced according to the law. So Pastor Kua was acquitted on January 2nd. I was sentenced to life imprisonment, which was then presented like 24 years in prison. And Pastor Kua and the interpreter Abdelmola, they too were sentenced to, again, not really properly interpreted, but it was presented in the newspaper, being sentenced to 12 years, each one of them. And, after my release, I was very active and in connection with U.S. congressmen, senators, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that even tried to get them released as well. And they spent about 3 more months in prison, in Kobe prison, and eventually they also were released based on the same type like me, the presidential pardon. And so that happened on May 11th, 2017.
So the presidential pardon that you received, Petr, do you think that was a result of those 3 things you talked about, the negotiations, the petition that people signed, but also God's intervention? Yeah,
absolutely. I would say that the most important was the Lord's decision. If He's the one, we serve the Lord that is the one who, when He closes the door, no one can open. And when He opens the door, no one can keep it closed. So that's probably the major factor.
Could I ask you about your upbringing in what was once called Czechoslovakia? How did your upbringing there expose you for the first time to persecution?
I grew up in a pastor's family in the communist Czechoslovakia, which was not a good combination to live under communism, to being a Christian and being a son of a pastor. So we have experienced persecution in our own lives. My father was a pastor in the official church, which was very much state controlled. So he decided to be more active in the underground church, which could not be controlled directly. But we became, as our family, our house became surveilled by the secret police for 24/7. And I remember one day I came from, I was a freshman in a high school. I was also a freshly baptized believer, and came home from the high school and realized that both of my parents were arrested and interrogated by secret police. At that time, I thought it was like the most difficult time, but when my father came home, he gave me to read the Richard Wurmbrand's book, in God's underground. Richard Wurmbrand is a Romanian pastor who spent 14 years in communist prisons in communist Romania, and he's actually the founder of the large family of missions like Release International, Voice of the Martyrs, that are helping persecuted Christians. And for me, that was a very important moment when I got encouraged through reading how he received the strength from the Lord Jesus to continue his Christian witness despite horrible beatings, torture, and brainwashing. And for me, that personally was the most important book after Bible that I read. And I still consider it like the moment when my future work for the persecuted church actually started. I see it like a really interesting moment, segments of my life, like going through persecution, being freed from that, and then serving the persecuted church for like 25 years, and then having this privilege to also suffer with them in the same place. I believe that the Lord will use me now even more to be the voice of those voiceless Christians and to spread out the information about our persecuted brothers and sisters.
Thanks for listening to The Profile on Premier Christian Radio. Don't go anywhere. We'll be back with another guest right after this.
Premier Christianity magazine. In this month's issue,
he's the pastor famous for marrying Kanye West and Kim Kardashian. We talked to the megachurch preacher Rich Wilkerson Jr. Jesus told us to love our neighbours, but do we even know who they are? Read our shocking reports. Plus, discover how Catholics are questioning the Pope's views on doctrine and why are so many young men following Jordan B. Peterson.
For your free copy, visit premierchristianity.com/free sample.
The Profile. You're listening to Premier Christian Radio.
Where faith comes to life.
Well, hello and welcome to The Profile here on Premier Christian Radio with me, Sam Hales. The Profile is the show where we delve into a person's life, faith and ministry, and it's brought to you in association with the UK's leading Christian magazine. That's Premier Christianity magazine, the magazine that I edit. And if you would like a free sample copy of our latest issue, you can get one. Just head to our website, premierchristianity.com/free sample, and there you'll be able to read more great interviews, features, columnists, reviews, and more. But today on The Profile, I'm speaking to Lois Tverberg. Lois is an author and speaker on the Jewishness of Jesus and the Hebraic roots of the Christian faith. Her latest book is titled Reading the Bible with Rabbi Jesus, How a Jewish Perspective Can Transform Your Understanding. She's also the founder of the Engedi Resource Centre, which aims to deepen Christian understanding of the Bible in its original context. Lois lives in the USA, in Michigan, but she's dropped into Premier today as part of her UK speaking tour. And Lois, it's great to have you here.
Thank you.
Wonderful that you're able to come over to the UK and talk about this subject that you're so passionate about the Hebraic background to the scriptures. I know this is a journey that started for you some 20 years ago now. Would you like to take us back to how this all began?
Long ago and far away, back in Michigan, I was actually a biology professor. My training is actually in the sciences, and I was a biology professor. I come from a devout Christian family, but an educated Christian family. We had lots of Christian paperbacks, but we come from a Lutheran mainline church background, and I have to say, as much as I would have probably gotten straight A's if they gave you grades in Sunday school, but still at the same time, there were all sorts of head-scratching questions back, when I was 20 years ago, and I signed up for a church class. It sounded a little bit academic. It's about the land and culture and the Jewish context of Jesus and the Bible. And I said, well, it sounds like dry information. I better sign up. And it just was like a fire hydrant that just exploded with all sorts of greenery. It was just amazing to be able to find so much context that filled in those questions and foggy areas in my Bible reading, and that's where I got my start, was when I started studying there.
We'll delve much more into that as we go through, but here on the profile, we always like to go back right to the beginning of a person's life. I'd love to hear more about your Christian upbringing. You mentioned it was Lutheran, maybe a kind of form of Christianity that most UK Christians wouldn't be familiar with, so maybe you can give us a bit of more detail about that.
Sure, okay. My family is 100% Norwegian American. So my grandparents on both sides came over. But actually, my grandparents on my dad's side became missionaries to Madagascar. And so they were, and then I have lots of pastor cousins and uncles on my father's side. So a very active Christian family in teaching evangelism. When you hear the word Lutheran, at least in the U.S., we have kind of a wide gamut of people from conservative to liberal, and I would say that my own background with my missionary grandparents was much more on the I would say evangelical side of things. So that was my growing up. Had plenty of Bible knowledge, although we were very strong on New Testament and very, I'd say, uninterested in Old Testament, figuring we had kind of grown beyond that. And I've since learned otherwise, that you need more than that.
You still encounter that a lot with Christians in general, don't you? Of often much more of an interest in the New Testament than the Old. And maybe some of that even comes down to the language, that we call it the New Testament. And so the Old can kind of feel irrelevant. So I guess part of your journey was undoing some of that, was it? Exactly.
Honestly, it was that has been one of the major things, and I have described it like when you go to Hawaii. We have this lovely state. I haven't been there, but if you go to one of their peaks in the middle of Hawaii, what you'll find is if you go snorkeling, you're actually at the top of one of the highest mountains on Earth, close to the height of Mount Everest, because you keep going down, 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 down. And when you hear Jesus's words, or you see something that he's done that is fulfilling something that they have been talking about and ruminating on through the scriptures all the way back from Genesis, that is incredibly powerful. It puts Jesus' life in context and adds meaning, but it really roots your faith, and that's really the thing that, until I started digging in my Old Testament, I never would have known about. Yes.
So tell me more about what made you, first of all, go into the sciences, and I think you studied for a PhD as well.
That's right.
This is, in some ways, it would seem very unconnected from what we're talking about today. So tell me more about that.
Sure. Well, you can hear my family had both a ministry background, but yet my family also had a science interest. And my dad, when he went to college, he said, I like the sciences and I want to serve the Lord, but I would rather be a physician. So he went into medicine, and I have mathematicians, lots of science. The essence of my family, I'm the youngest of 7, so we're all nerds. And, so we are nerds in business and science, and that was my direction. But whenever you go to a new church, they always say, well, what are your spiritual gifts? What do you want to do? And so, of course, I like teaching. And so that was part of why I was taking classes, as I like to teach. And so it was an easy integration between, I was already teaching it in the sciences. And then when I started learning about the context of the Bible, I started teaching classes on that. And that started writing little articles. And then we put them on a website, and then put them in books. That's kind of how I segued from the science world. I would say I'm the thing that they teach you when you're working on your PhD, even if you're doing it on some DNA molecule, is that you learn how to dig through what research is out there to sift between solid things and not so solid. And actually that helps some, even when you're doing studies on biblical context is to know how to look through research and find what's useful and what isn't.
I imagine the process of researching on a scientific level is probably similar to the research you do now, which, as you say, is into the kind of Hebraic background to the scriptures. But for those who are coming to this topic completely new and perhaps wouldn't even know what we'd mean by Hebraic background to the scriptures, I wonder if you could share, again, from some of your story, one of the first things you encountered that was kind of one of these light bulb moments that kind of brought your faith alive in a new way when you realized the background.
One of the areas of interest is Jesus's words themselves, to realize that he's actually a part of a bigger conversation, and really what we have when we're reading the Gospels, it's like we've got a cell phone where we can hear the person speaking, but we can't hear the person on the other side of the cell phone. And if you hear the rest of the conversation, his words make a lot more sense. You hear him inputting on rabbinic debates of the time. You hear, like, one of the things that I found quite meaningful was when Jesus talks about, do not judge or you will be judged. And I think, most people just, well, that's impossible. It's one of those things you say, oh, that's nice, love your enemies, do not judge. Okay, well, it's pious, but you kind of give up on that because it's just too hard. But then I found out that there was an entire really intelligent debate among the rabbis of that era about what does it mean to judge a person fairly. And what they said, if you want to judge somebody fairly, you should judge them on the side of favor. You give them the benefit of the doubt. When Jesus says, with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. The idea is you weigh a little extra in their pan in order to balance your first negative assumptions. Obviously, so what tends to happen is we tend to think the worst of others. We actually it's because of our own sinful attitudes. We know what we're like, so we tend to accuse others very quickly. So the rabbis had a lot of really good commentary on how to balance that. And then Jesus actually kind of pushes beyond. He kind of pushes it to the conclusion is, really the only person you can know is your own sinful heart. Let the Lord judge others. Have mercy on others so that the Lord will have mercy on you. Let the Lord judge, but there's a sense that he kind of spins it differently, but yet the rabbinic ideas of his time actually helped me understand the things that Jesus was saying and make them more applicable.
And that's the theme that really comes through a lot of your work. I mean, I remember when I first read Sitting at the Feet of Rabbi Jesus, which was really your first major book on the subject. It was written with Anne Spangler. And it did really fascinate me at the time. I'd never delved into this subject before. And you think, oh, wow, okay, the context behind Jesus' words, as you say, that he was speaking into another conversation that we may not be aware of, really makes sense of some of his phrases, which I think most Christians, have to be honest, are a little bit head-scratching at times.
Yeah, right.
Is this kind of how you would describe your calling today, to open this thing up for Christians?
Oh, very much so, yes. I guess I would say that has been my passion. As long as there are things that make me nod my head and say, I don't know what could that be, I will keep studying. And that's a kind of a sifting process. And there are different scholars with different ideas, and so you can't necessarily say we've found the absolute definite answer, but what really has, if you're why on earth, why am I doing it now? Well, actually, because in the past 10, 20 years there really has been just an explosion of information and interest in it, because you see Christians and Jews studying together, looking at the early documents together in ways that they haven't been for centuries and millennia.
It's quite is an intriguing development. I mean, I guess we should be mindful as well of some of the bad history there's been between Jews and Christians down the centuries of some terrible quote unquote Christian anti-Semitism that's happened. For there now to be Jews and Christians, as you say, coming together and looking at this is quite a remarkable development. This is a lot of this obviously is happening on an academic level.
That's right.
Is your work in part trying to bring this to a more popular level audience?
Completely. I spend my time in the heavy-duty scholarly material. Love it. But I feel like my own calling is to the regular Joe person who has a pretty good understanding of their Christian faith, a pretty good understanding of their Bible. I'm not trying to walk in as the authority who is now going to decree the truth. I'm a very good student. I'm a very good reader, and so I share people the insights that the scholars have been discussing that they might be interested in and might be useful, that will mature and change their faith. It isn't just an academic thing. It's often, it can deepen and enrich your own relationship with God when you hear something Jesus says that, wow, that's a new way of looking at things.
Let's talk about some of the Jewish festivals, because again, I think the average Christian wouldn't really know much about, for example, the Feast of Tabernacles, what that even was, and certainly what relevance that would have for Christians today. So can you talk more perhaps about one or two of the feasts and what that means for Christians?
Sure. Well, the one that people know about most often is Passover in the spring. We know about Jesus and the Last Supper. It's on Passover. There's unending richness just in studying that one. But Tabernacles is in the fall, and it is part of the harvest festivals. Then what they're supposed to do is build a booth, a very rickety little tent, and they're supposed to live in it for a week in order to remember how they lived out in the desert and to recall the 40 years of wandering where the Lord brought them out of Egypt on their way to the Promised Land, where they had nothing to rely on except for the Lord. And part of it, what's fascinating is you can see these delightful paradoxes. It's the Harvest Festival where they're surrounded by their greatest wealth of the year. They hang little decorations of fruit and whatever, and so they're celebrating the harvest, and yet they're remembering their utter dependence on God, and that for a week, if you do it yourself, it can be quite transformative. So and you also notice how God tends to both times of year. They are being thankful for what they have right then, and yet they're recalling their redemption. That's a very strong theme of remember that I have redeemed you, and then live that out, and then do that for others. One rabbi had pointed out to me, you know that many of the laws of the Torah are directly based on remember how I brought you out of Egypt. You shall not oppress the foreigner, for you were foreigners. They're supposed to recall that. And even the Sabbath, you shall release your slaves for one day a week because you were slaves. You shall remember. And I find that as a Christian powerful, because that's really what Jesus, when he says, know that you have been redeemed from your sins. Therefore, it is absolutely, you must also release other people from their sins. It's very much, he is using that same logic that is interwoven in the Torah throughout the life of Israel. He's using that in communicating the message to us again.
And some of this stuff operates on a kind of level of even how we come to the Bible in the first place. So I know one of the things you've done some work on is the difference between a kind of Greek mindset and a Hebrew mindset, and how most Westerners think like a Greek, I guess, going back to some of your scientific background, quite kind of logical.
Yes.
Can you explain how the Hebraic mindset is different, and why it matters that Jesus and the early disciples would have kind of thought differently to how we think today?
Okay, sure. I'll give you an example. Well, there's a well-known guy, Ken Bailey. I assume you might have read his material.
Yes.
He admits that he went through graduate school, he got his degree in systematic theology, and he loved the writings of Paul, but he had to admit that he kind of disrespected Jesus because he kept telling these parables that sounded like kids' stories. So he wants long theological terminology. That's how Greeks like.
Yeah.
They like to build things logically in terms of this, therefore this, therefore this. That came from the Greek culture. But before that, there was a perfectly fine way to communicate that was much more prone to using parables and stories and experiential descriptions. They spoke in pictures and in concrete terms. You can pack a lot of very profound things into concrete terms, but the Greeks tend to have kind of a condescending attitude. If you don't use abstract terminology, it's not intelligent. And so that is kind of the contrast, is the parables and imagery versus the definitions and the theological argumentation. That's the shift that you hear between even Jesus and Paul.
Right.
Even Paul is speaking more to a Greek Western group than Jesus is.
Does this explain why so many Christians, including when we come to study theology, do spend a lot of time unpacking what are the doctrines that Paul taught and less time kind of interpreting the parables, really?
Exactly. Because it's just very foreign to us. We don't know the ground rules, and so we don't really realize. And honestly, it demands of you that you need to have some background in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. The thing you hear throughout the New Testament is Jesus is called the Lamb of God, who takes away the sins of the. You keep hearing about the Lamb of God or the imagery in Revelation, who's on the throne, and we just don't realize that to a Hebrew would be pulling out Isaiah 53, where this, surely we have sinned, and he took the sins upon us, and it would be reminding us of Passover. It'd be reminding us of the sacrifices that we made when we committed sins. These images presume a literacy and a familiarity with the Old Testament. And honestly, our theological abstract bent tends to summarize, boil down, and reduce all of those potent, pregnant images into labels. Substitutionary atonement. Well, you'll never have to read Isaiah 53 again because you've got the term substitutionary atonement, but you also just don't hear the emotional impact of this innocent little lamb who goes to its death without protest. It just that all of that emotional impact, all of the depth of the context is missing.
I know some have been kind of critical of this movement of looking into the Jewish roots, the Hebraic roots to Christianity. Some have looked at this kind of work and they've said things like, well, this sounds a bit Gnostic. This sounds a bit sort of, there's hidden meanings in the text and you can only really get to it if you read certain books or understand the original languages. And some people have kind of been a bit hesitant about going down this road. Can you respond to that?
I understand their hesitancy. It's a little frustrating because with any new form of study, you're going to find good sources and bad sources. And then we have this wild, wonderful world of the internet that has allowed anybody with any voice to start speaking. And there is a lot of very poor information. I tend to err on the side of academia because academia is where you're going to have people going back and forth and being corrected in their insights when their insights are just too speculative. And probably this is not where Jesus was going with this. That's why I aim for the academic world. You have a lot of people who are, what happens is they grab hold of things little obvious things like, the names of the people in the Bible, they said them in Hebrew rather than in English. And so it's Yeshua versus Jesus. And some people are very strong on the names themselves, and people wonder, Lois, why aren't you using the correct names? Well, what you find is people get really emotional, and just a shift in wording can just drive a person nuts, and they have kind of a chip on their shoulder where they just can't stand to hear the old way of understanding. If people aren't using the new lingo, if they aren't using Jewish terminology, they just can't stand it.
Right.
That I found really damaging and really unuseful. And my own rule in my life, I have this motto. It is, be a bridge, not an island. And what a lot of people do is they hear a few insights and then they get angry that somehow they didn't know it before, and then they angrily walk out and they want to learn a whole new lingo. They join a club, and then they can't figure out why all of their friends get irritated at them. So you see this propensity towards breaking away. I call it brittleness, that people can't hang on to the good in their faith and then grow with it. They tend to just, if they listen to angry teachers, they tend to become angry. Yeah. So there is, I would say there's some cautions. A lot of people just adopt the lingo and then come up with their own silly stuff. That doesn't have any research behind it.
Yeah, and it's really interesting as well what you say about people kind of going off and creating their own silo and being angry at other people for not getting it. Because it's interesting to me how it's not just with this whole area of Hebraic roots.
Yeah, right.
There's almost any area of Christianity that tends to happen, doesn't
Pretty
it?
much.
Where people get particularly passionate about one area of their faith. Perhaps even an area they're called to, or an area God's given them insight, but it kind of tips over from this is something that's good and positive to becoming all-encompassing, and there's anger towards those who just don't get it.
Exactly. And the ironic thing, I was talking about judging on the side of favor is that there's a sense that you have to remember to judge on the side of favor everybody else. And the fact that you yourself did not know this
5 minutes ago.
5 minutes ago. And so, people, why didn't my pastor teach me this? And just imagine your pastor in his study the night before saying, oh, there are 20 wonderful insights that I could share, but I won't because I don't want to share these. Don't you think your pastor, him or herself, might have wanted to share? So it's people have to learn to get beyond some of their emotional reactions.
It's been said before, and it should be pointed out, it's been said with a smile and with a good heart, not in a rude way, but where you have two Jewish people, there are often three opinions. And where, again, when you read the New Testament and you see some of this going on and this kind of discussion, this dialogue, this debate, it strikes me as well that often in Christian circles there are a few different things we love to debate, and in a very kind of Greek way. And one of the classics is something like, do we have free will or are we predestined? Is it appropriate to apply some of that thinking to some of these more contemporary debates and say, well, it seems like in this culture there was an idea of holding two things in tension on this hand and on the other hand that. Is it appropriate to apply this thinking to that kind of a debate?
Well, it really surprised me when I first read one rabbi said, all is under the hand of God, and yet man has free will. On the one hand, but on the other hand, period. That was it. And that it was the answer to that was the comment that was recorded. Really, what's frustrating is that because we pin our faith kind of on doctrines, on the right answers, we don't really, what they tend to pin their faith on is the scriptures themselves. That the reason why he says this is because you have places where God says, in 430 years, Egypt has not reached the Amorites have not become so evil that I'm going to send you in to punish them. Very much a sense of God knows the future. And yet there are other places where God says, choose this day who you will serve. That's Joshua. So he's saying those two things because he's recalling the scriptures. Instead of clinging to having one right, consistent answer, he's saying ultimately the place where we draw our data from has to be scripture itself, not from whether it's logical and works out according to the way we want it to. The whole understanding, Western rationality takes the assumption that we can and we will be able to understand everything rationally it sets its limits at that, and then it arbitrarily makes the assumption that that's possible, that to extend it infinitely. And really that is not a biblical expectation. This is a God who created the universe. The only way you know him is by what he reveals about himself.
Thank you so much, Lois, for dropping into us here at Premier Christian Radio and telling us more about your work. As I say, I've just really benefited from it personally and so grateful for you taking the time. The latest book, if you want to get hold of it, I do recommend it. It's Reading the Bible with Rabbi Jesus. It's out now, published by Baker, but I recommend all of Lois's books. They're all available online and at her website, so do check it out. For now, Lois, thank you so much for coming in.
Thanks so much, Sam.
Thanks so much for listening to The Profile here on Premier Christian Radio this afternoon. It's been great to have you with us for those 2 interviews today. If you are listening on Premier Christian Radio, you may be interested to know that this show is now available as a podcast, meaning you can check out past shows and listen on the go wherever you are. For full details on that, just head to premierchristianradio.com/The Profile. We're also, of course, available wherever you normally get your podcasts from, so why not check us out, have a listen to all those great past interviews we've done, and leave us a rating as well, because that would really help. For now, though, that's all we've got time for this week. We'll be back same time, same place next week for another sit-down interview with a leading Christian here on The Profile. Coming up next on Premier Christian Radio is Premier Playback. We'll see you next time.